I want to show you a number. $40,000. That is what sits in my savings account right now. Not invested, not locked in a retirement account I cannot touch, just sitting there, liquid, real. $40,000 I worked for, saved deliberately, and watched grow through consistent decisions I am genuinely proud of. And I am scared about money. Not occasionally. I mean the specific, low-grade, constant hum of financial fear that exists in the background of an ordinary Tuesday when nothing is actually wrong. I have $40,000 saved, and I still feel, on some level, like I am one piece of bad news away from disaster. For a long time, I assumed this feeling would disappear once I hit a number. I thought $10,000 would do it, then $25,000. Now I have $40,000, and the feeling is fundamentally unchanged, even as the number behind it has grown. So I did what I always do when something about my financial life does not make sense. I pulled it apart. I read the research. I talked to people across a wide range of net worths. And what I found explains something I think almost nobody with savings has heard articulated clearly. The fear is not about the money. The money was never the variable that was going to fix it. My name is Zane, and I spend an unreasonable amount of time thinking about the invisible systems that govern how we actually feel about our financial lives, as opposed to how the numbers on paper suggest we should feel. If you have ever looked at your own savings, whatever the number is, and felt that same persistent hum of fear despite doing the responsible thing, this video is for you. Subscribe and give this a thumbs up, because today I think we get somewhere real. Let's start with the research, because one finding reframes this entire conversation. In 2010, economists Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton published a study that has become one of the most cited and most misunderstood pieces of research in behavioral economics. They found that emotional well-being rises with income up to a point, then plateaus. Beyond that point, more money does not produce more daily emotional well-being. But there is a part of this research stream that almost never gets discussed, and it is the part that matters most here. The relationship between savings and felt financial security follows a similar pattern to income and happiness. It's not really about the absolute number. It's about the relationship between the number and a reference point your brain constructs, a reference point that moves. When I had $5,000, that number felt meaningful relative to my expenses, relative to what I had previously had, which was close to nothing. It felt like real progress. At $15,000, the same pattern repeated. It felt significant relative to a new internal reference point that had quietly recalibrated upward in the background. At $40,000, the same thing happened again. My brain was never comparing my savings to a fixed objective threshold of safety. It was comparing my savings to a constantly moving internal benchmark that updates itself every time I reach the previous one. This is not a personal failing. It is the emotional expression of the same hedonic adaptation that governs nearly every area of human experience. There is no dollar amount of savings that will, on its own, eliminate financial fear. Not $40,000, not $100,000, not $500,000. The number was never the mechanism. The relationship between the number and a constantly recalibrating reference point is the mechanism. Until you address that relationship directly, you can save indefinitely, and the underlying feeling will simply relocate to whatever new number you reach. Personal finance advice has a number repeated so often it has become almost scriptural. 3 to 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund. I followed it. I calculated my expenses, multiplied by 6, and built toward that number with genuine discipline. I exceeded it. I currently have closer to 8 months saved. The fear did not go away when I crossed the 6-month threshold. It barely moved.
Here is what nobody tells you about that guideline.
It is calculated from the outside by professionals, applied generically across millions of different psychological relationships with risk. It tells you almost nothing about what will actually make a specific person feel secure, because financial security is not really a math problem. It is a psychology problem wearing a math costume. The 3 to 6 month guideline assumes fear is calibrated to objective risk, that if you mathematically cover the realistic range of unemployment or repair costs, your brain registers risk covered and stands down. But fear does not usually work through cost-benefit calculation. It works through pattern recognition and a deeply individual relationship with uncertainty that has little to do with spreadsheet math. Someone who grew up with chronic financial instability can have $100,000 saved and still feel dread that someone who grew up financially secure might never feel with $10,000. The math is identical. The felt experience is completely different because the felt experience was never primarily about the math. I want you to notice the actual shape of financial fear, because this is where the real mechanism lives. When I try to name exactly what I am afraid of, it almost never resolves into something specific. It is not, "I am afraid my transmission fails and costs $3,200. That fear, if it were the real content, would be addressable. I could calculate the probability, set aside a reasonable amount, and feel the specific risk covered. Instead, the fear resolves into something vague. What if something happens? What if things go wrong? These are not specific risks with dollar amounts attached. They are open-ended and unaddressable by any specific amount of money because they were never pointing at a quantified threat in the first place. Vague fear cannot be resolved by savings because savings is a specific, bounded thing, and vague fear is not specific. You cannot fully satisfy an unbounded worry with a bounded resource. No matter how large the resource grows, the unbounded worry continues generating new unaddressed scenarios just beyond whatever threshold you reach. I noticed this directly. At $20,000 saved, the vague fear manifested as, what if I lose my job and cannot find another one for a long time? At $40,000, the same fear simply substituted a new scenario. What if there is a medical situation that exceeds even this? The fear was never computing whether $40,000 was sufficient for a specific realistic scenario. It was generating whatever scenario remained unaddressed by the current level. This might be the most important section for anyone like me who has built real savings and still feels afraid. Having money and feeling permitted to use the money are two separate psychological states. I assumed they were the same thing. They are not. If a genuine emergency happened tomorrow, I have the money. The math says I'm covered. But when I imagine actually spending a meaningful portion of that $40,000, even for something it was explicitly saved for, I feel a distinct resistance. Not because the money is not there, but because some part of my psychology has come to relate to the existence of the number as the source of security, rather than relating to the money as a tool meant to be deployed when its purpose arrives. The savings account becomes, somewhere in the process of building it, an object of security in itself, rather than a resource intended for use. Once that shift happens, spending any portion of it, even correctly, registers not as using my emergency fund properly, but as losing the thing that has been making me feel safe. This explains something that confused me for years. People with substantial emergency funds often report real anxiety when they actually use the fund for an emergency. Anxiety not about the emergency itself, but specifically about watching the number decrease. The number had become the comfort. Decreasing it, even for its intended purpose, feels like losing the comfort, regardless of whether the financial logic is sound. A bigger number does not fix the permission problem. It just gives the permission problem a bigger number to feel anxious about losing. Financial security is rarely evaluated in true isolation. It is evaluated relative to a comparison set. Friends, colleagues, social media, an ambient cultural sense of what doing well looks like. And that comparison set is not fixed. It moves, often upward as your own circumstances change. When I had less saved, my comparison set was largely people in similar or worse positions, and $15,000 felt substantial relative to that group. As my own position improved, my visibility into people with significantly more increased, not because those people suddenly appeared, but because improved standing tends to expand the circles in which comparison happens. The research here is consistent and uncomfortable. Relative financial position predicts subjective financial well-being more strongly in many studies than absolute position does. The experience of having enough is shaped significantly by who you happen to be comparing yourself to in a given season, largely outside your conscious control. I have $40,000. Relative to a friend with $4,000, this should feel substantial security. But if my attention lands, even briefly, on a colleague with $200,000, the same $40,000 can suddenly feel inadequate. Not because anything about my actual position changed, but because the reference point shifted. This mechanism alone explains a significant portion of why savings growth does not produce proportional growth in felt security. There is a more subtle mechanism worth walking through because it explains something genuinely strange about newly accumulated savings. For most of my adult life, my internal self-concept included some version of a person who does not have much saved. This was simply accurate for a long period, and like most accurate, long-held facts about oneself, it became part of the quiet architecture of how I understood my own financial existence. When the actual number changed, the underlying identity did not update at the same speed. There's a lag between financial reality and the internal narrative about what kind of financial person you are. This lag makes the savings feel provisional, not fully real, as if the number could not possibly be accurate because it does not match the internal story still running in the background. And something that feels provisional does not produce the same felt security a number perceived as solid and integrated into identity would produce. This is closely related to what researchers studying sudden wealth, lottery winners, people with rapid income growth or inheritances have documented extensively. Financial reality changes faster than internal identity does, and the gap produces genuine psychological discomfort, sometimes severe enough that people unconsciously spend new resources down to match the older, more familiar identity. I do not believe I have done this dramatically, but I recognize the smaller version of the same mechanism in my own resistance to fully feeling the security that $40,000 should provide on paper. Some part of my internal architecture has not updated the file. I want to bring these mechanisms together with what I think is the most actionable insight in this video. Every mechanism described shares a common root: the recalibrating reference point, the vague, unbounded fear, the permission problem, the moving comparison set, the identity lag. All five operate so powerfully, specifically because there has never been a clear, personally defined answer to one question: what number, specifically, constitutes enough for me? Not the generic 3 to 6 months guideline calculated by someone who never met you. A specific number, calculated by you based on your actual life, your actual obligations, your actual risk tolerance, that you explicitly decide in advance will represent the threshold beyond which additional savings serves a different purpose entirely: investment, opportunity, generosity, rather than continuing to serve the ambiguous, unbounded function of general safety. Without this defined floor, savings has no natural stopping point at which the brain is given permission to register the goal as achieved. The reference point keeps recalibrating because there was never a fixed target. The fear stays vague because there was never a specific threshold to test it against. The comparison trap stays powerful because there was never an internal anchor, leaving external comparison as the only available reference point. I sat down and did something I had genuinely never done in all my years of saving. I defined, in writing, what my actual floor was, calculated from my real monthly obligations and real risk factors, not from what felt impressive or matched a borrowed guideline. The number I arrived at, after honest calculation, was lower than my current $40,000, which means that by my own deliberately defined standard, I am not undersaved. I am already secure by a meaningful margin. This single act, defining the floor specifically and in writing, rather than leaving it as an ambient, perpetually recalibrating feeling, did more to change my actual felt experience of financial security than any of the dollars I had saved in the years leading up to it. 5 specific shifts. There is no app, no 3-step formula that resolves this completely. But there are 5 concrete shifts that directly address the 5 mechanisms above, and you can begin all of them this week, regardless of your current balance. Shift 1. Define your specific floor in writing. Calculate your genuine essential monthly expenses, not an aspirational budget, the actual floor of what your life costs. Multiply by the number of months that reflects your honest personal risk tolerance. Write the number down somewhere permanent. Everything below it serves safety. Everything above it is free to serve something else. Shift 2. Convert vague fear into specific scenarios with specific costs. When the unbounded what if something happens feeling arises, force it into specificity. What exactly is the scenario? What would it actually cost based on real research rather than imagined worst cases? Most people who do this discover their vague fear, once made specific, costs significantly less than their current savings already covers. Shift 3. Practice small, deliberate withdrawals to break the permission problem. If you have never used any portion of your savings for its intended purpose, the first real emergency will feel disproportionately distressing, regardless of how sound the logic is. Use a small, planned portion, deliberately, in a low-stakes moment, and observe that the number decreasing does not destroy your security. This rebuilds the relationship between the money and its function, rather than letting the number become the object of attachment itself. Shift 4. Choose your comparison set deliberately. You cannot eliminate social comparison, but you can become conscious of which set you are unconsciously absorbing and weight your attention towards comparisons that reflect genuine progress rather than whatever happens to be currently visible. The specific comparison set you're exposed to in a given week is largely arbitrary. Treating it as a definitive measure of your adequacy gives a random sample of other people's circumstances far more power than it deserves. Shift 5. Update your internal identity deliberately. If your self-concept is not caught up to your actual position, do not wait for it to update on its own. State in specific terms what is now true, not as a vague affirmation, but as a factual correction to an outdated internal file. I have built $40,000 through years of deliberate decisions. This is real. This belongs to who I actually am now. This feels uncomfortable initially, precisely because it is doing the work of closing the identity lag directly. The number that actually changed something. I started this video with $40,000. I want to end it with a different number. After calculating my actual essential expenses, multiplying by a risk tolerance I arrived at through honest reflection, and converting my vague fears into specific, researched, real-cost scenarios, the number that represents my actual defined floor of financial safety is $31,000. I have $40,000. By my own specific, deliberately calculated standard, I am not behind. I am ahead by $9,000. That $9,000 is no longer serving fear management. It has been freed by my own explicit decision to serve something else. The fear did not disappear instantly. Old patterns do not dissolve the moment you understand the mechanism producing them. but something genuinely shifted. The vague, unbounded, perpetually recalibrating quality of the fear became for the first time something specific and measurable. And specific, measurable things can actually be resolved in a way vague, unbounded things never can. If you have savings right now, any amount, and you still feel that same persistent hum of fear despite having done the responsible thing, hear this clearly. The number was never going to fix it. Not your current number, not double it. The relationship between your number and a deliberately defined floor is what fixes it. And that relationship is available to you starting today, regardless of your current balance. Calculate your floor. Write it down. Compare your actual savings against that specific number rather than against the ambient, ever-moving feeling of, is this enough? You may find, as I did, that you are closer to enough than the feeling has been telling you. Or you may find a genuinely specific gap, which is its own kind of relief, because a specific gap can be closed in a way a vague, unbounded fear never can. The $40,000 sitting in my account did not create the security I was looking for. The number I wrote down, calculated specifically and deliberately, did. That distinction is the entire video. If this gave you something real to think about, smash that like button and subscribe to Wealth with Zane, because we are going to keep doing this, pulling back the curtain on the invisible psychological systems that determine whether your financial life actually feels the way the numbers suggest it should. I will see you in the next one.